Hello, and welcome to the second episode of the Ultimate PastCast. In this episode, we will be doing the history of political conflict. I saw this is a fitting topic considering the events that took place at the Capitol building in America
Disgraceful.
on Wednesday. Yeah, I mean, that's a good way to put it. So, I'm Ashley, or HistorMeans123 on Instagram. And with me is my co-host, Miguel. Say hello.
Hello.
Today we have another guest who, I mean, he's probably just going to be vibing most of the time instead of actually putting any input in. But he's still here. This is Felipe.
Hello.
Yeah, right. Just before we get into any discussion, just want to make a comment on the length in between the last episode and this episode. To be honest with you, I couldn't be asked to put it out. I did record a bunch of stuff, but there was a lot of complications, and I was the only one in it, and I didn't really enjoy what came out of it because there was no real discussion. So you probably won't see those episodes, but maybe you will. Maybe I'll re-record it, get some discussion in, right? So let's go. This first topic point, I sort of want to get your guys' opinion on the situation at the Capitol building, and then we'll sort of discuss why it's relevant to the further history of political conflict. So, anyone want to step in with their opinions?
Felipe, if you don't mind, I can take the floor on this one just for a second.
Yeah, that's cool.
I think what they've done in America, I feel like it's an embarrassment. I mean, it's really bad, man. It's not good whatsoever. I think just to every other country, they just looks at America, if anything, of like, this is what democracy. America's essentially self-entitled the centerpiece of democracy, and if that's what it sort of does, it's like fucking hell.
Yeah, exactly. I would say, like, because you have this major point of like a lot of American politics is based on American exceptionalism, which is this idea that America are they're the home of the free. They're the big dogs in democracy, and they are the sort of the founding basis of democracy, and they're the big model. So I think that, yeah, I agree with you in that it's a little bit of a disgrace in that, and it makes them look disorganized, chaotic.
I think Felipe, what do you think about this situation in America?
I think it just plays bad in generally on like all Republicans, because like you're just like putting yourself against Biden supporters. And
What could you say? Is there any sort of similarities with the Black Lives Matter protests, or the more liberal?
Not similar. There's certainly differences, such as how police treated them.
Did you see
basically
that?
Just let them walk in.
Did you see the clip of the guy who was like going and like it showed a scrape on his hand and said, "If you don't stand up, this is what could happen to your children."
Yeah, exactly.
Meanwhile, Black Lives Matter getting pepper sprayed.
I think they're overreacting,
children.
to be honest. That guy had a good point. I think that that those rioters need to calm it down and see what real damage looks like.
What were you going to say, Felipe? Sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, 2 police officers have died in the U.S. Capitol riots, and Black Lives Matter, like 0 police officers died.
2 died?
Yeah, apparently.
Oh shit.
I think 5 people have died, and 2 of them are police officers.
Oh my god.
See, this is a problem though, in that I sort of think that the reason that this happened, it's been a trend. I think I definitely predicted that something of this caliber might have happened. I wouldn't say I'm predicted 100% that it would happen, but by looking at sort of just the climate in America, it was sort of a little bit obvious that something like this would have happened, because the trend in US politics has been sort of following a similar trend to that of political conflict in history. And certainly from us living in the UK, I'm starting to see a little bit of that coming about as well.
Or in England.
In the UK as well, yes, and I think all across Europe as well. I'm not, because my idea on modern politics in Africa and Asia are a little bit fuzzy. I mean, Africa is pretty simple. It's the same as it's always been. A post-colonial world, which is just infighting. But Asia, it's a little bit harder to sort of explain.
Yeah.
Other than stuff like this, the Capitol riots, Capitol building riots, that just pushes them further away from democracy, which in the end, I mean, we live in the West, so obviously we're going to have a more, we're going to want the West to succeed more. That's just the natural way in which it is, which means that for the Western world especially, it's not great, you know, it's pushing more into Chinese influence and whatnot, but that's for another podcast. But there are certainly devastating aspects, and there's an aspect here that America sort of have lost more in terms of what we call soft power, which is necessary for their foreign strategy. And they've been really hurt by the Trump administration, and now they've pretty much lost the last little resemblance of soft power that they have across the world, really, for them to still be justified as a superpower.
Do you think America has any sort of like place now? Because I think overall they're sort of like, if the most influential country is America, I'd say, like culturally wise. Would you say not?
I would disagree now, because looking at the trend, so there is a trend with modern day,
or sort of say, for example, back in the day, America were the most influential. But I was sort of saying, do you think they've still got a place in that, or should they step down for like a China or Russia?
Here's the thing. This is what I was gonna say. Like, the world goes through different periods, right? So in the Victorian era, the singular global superpower was Britain, right? The British Empire. You know, it's known as the period of Pax Britannica because it was literally peace. That just means peace by Britain, which is essentially that Britain was so powerful that no nation could stand up to it, right? So everybody had to do what it said. So if you went to war and it went against Britain's interests, you just wouldn't go to war, right? That's the basic principle behind it, and it's true. Then that fizzled out, and the world formed into what was a great power stage. And in that great power stage, because America, who had the potential to become superpower, didn't take that opportunity, we ended up having 2 world wars, which led to the Cold War, which was actually what we call a bipolar order. So instead of a unipolar order, it was a bipolar order in which the Soviets and the Americans were there, right? The fall of the Soviets meant that there was a unipolar moment for the US. So throughout the 90s and the early 2000s, they exercised complete control in terms of just the state of the world at the time, right? And they had a lot of cultural influence. The problem is, after Iraq in 2003, right, and the Trump administration, right, because Trump has sort of gotten rid of this idea of soft power, which is basically puts culture and all of that ahead in front. Basically, with Trump's withdrawal of a lot of foreign intervention, we've seen a decline in US power in general, globally, and the rise in Chinese power, right? So I think that America are sort of stepping down now, and even with Biden putting domestic issues first before making any deals or anything outwards. So I think that definitely you've got a situation in which America are starting to be overtaken by China and other states like Russia, and you could even argue Germany or the European Union as a whole, considering that NATO is sort of now shifting away from relying on only American troops They're now all starting to raise up their military funding, whatnot. So America's sort of starting to lose their grip on the world. But in a sense, you kind of get the feeling that America want to lose it. They don't want to be in charge anymore. They just want to solve the issues. And this is where all of this little sidetrack is going to loop into the topic now. It's that American control, American sort of influence and position in the world basically meant that for a large portion of its citizens, right, its middle class and its working class, instead of America becoming this global superpower and everyone in America benefiting, what we saw was the rich and the super rich fly up and benefit and control everything, and the middle classes and the working classes got worse off than they were originally. So what's ended up happening is that they don't want to be a part of that anymore because they want their lives to improve, and you can't blame them. So the storming of the Capitol building thus is a result of this American sort of position as superpower in the world, right? And I think it's sort of like the boiling point, and now it's a little bit of the problem of this American exceptionalism and the way in which the Western world operates in terms of its ideals and its market and whatnot, has basically pushed for a system where people feel angry, right? And instead of putting their entire anger on the system as a whole, they put their anger towards a certain group of people. So for the Republicans, that's the Democrats, and for the Democrats, that's Republicans, right?
Who do you think sort of cultivated that sort of?
The elite, all of them in America, I will say, in America, the political elite, right, are the ones who did it. And because the political elite have ties to big businesses and big corporations, right? And in America, there's about 12 major news outlets, right? And those 12 major news outlets are owned by 6 of the same corporations, right? And not only do they have the major outlets, but then the rest of the outlets that are all American controlled, they're all owned by the 6 corporations. There's not a single news outlet in America that isn't owned by one of the 6 major corporations, right? And they all have political affiliations. Some prefer Democrats, some prefer Republicans. So what that means is that they push a narrative in the media, which is that your situation isn't because of America's foreign intervention. It isn't because of the lack of reform that gets pushed through Congress. It's the Democrats' fault, or it's the Republicans' fault. It's their fault. And while I don't agree with Trump on a large front of his policies and sort of just him in general, I feel like he's been demonized in the media because Trump bad, Democrats good, and then you've got the other way around where Trump good, Democrats bad. And the reason Trump can get away with that on the Republican side is that essentially he goes and does nothing. He does nothing different to what the other presidents did before him. But instead what he does is he goes, I haven't done anything because the Democrats won't let me. And then because people are more willing to believe it because they're in a terrible situation, and they're feeling angry at the Democrats anyway, or the consensus politicians, I should say. So even some Republicans sort of face the anger of Republican or the Trump supporters, and it's basically it's a toxic situation which keeps getting worse, right? So this is where we sort of get into the political conflict side of it. So it doesn't matter what era you subscribe to. So in America, it's the Democrats and the Republicans, right? So the Republicans, this is a distinction that that for people. So the Republicans are socially conservative, but economically they're liberal, right? So essentially, what that means is socially they don't really want to make any reforms, right? However, economically they're liberal, which means that they want free trade, they want reduced government influence, and sort of
Free
basically
markets and stuff, yeah.
pretty free market essentially, right? Sort of lower tariffs, whatnot, right?
So is that sort of against like isolationism?
It's actually, it pushes more for isolationism than it does, because what it pushes more of is, or what it basically it means that foreign intervention is less attractive, because if you're busy fighting in a country or causing war in a country, you're unable to make a profit out of them, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the Democrats are sort of, they're still liberal, but they're your modern liberals, right? And modern liberals are a little bit different, because they have aspects of the right wing liberal, so the Republican liberal model and social intervention model that comes a little bit from the socialist side, but not very much, right? So it's very minimal, and American left wing liberals would be right wing liberals everywhere else, right? So there really isn't much difference between the two groups, other than their willingness to change socially, right? So the Democrats are slightly more inclined to change socially, but they kind of want as it is now, because the system now guarantees that a Democrat or a Republican will become president, right? So that guarantees more of a chance for a Republican or a Democrat to get into where they want to be, right? Which means that will then push. Basically, it's better for them to have less of a fair time, or like to provide less fairness, than it is to sort of allow for social change, and then allow for more representation, and allow for a third party or fourth party to come in, right? So this is where political conflict is actually benefiting the institution of the government as a whole, whereas normally throughout history it usually undermines it, right? Which is it's very interesting, in the way that American politics has like political conflict has sort of grown, or like developed, right? So now, like, looking at it, so liberals and Republicans are the two big stuff that we look at, but there's other groups as well. You've got your more liberal groups, and just to distinguish for those who don't actually understand, right? America, no party in America are remotely socialist, right? Bernie Sanders is not a socialist. In fact, he embodies more of he embodies liberalism, right? And liberalism isn't evil. All it says is that people should be free to express themselves, as long as it doesn't harm anybody, right? People should be free to express themselves, right? That's basically the basic fundamentals of it. He is more of a modern liberal than most of the Democrat Party, in that he's more willing to make investments. But we see more of that with Andrew Yang, Pete Buttigieg, stuff like that, right? So, in fact, the Democratic side are becoming more and more left-wing, but that's not a bad thing, in terms of, because you need a little bit of a balance, because America is too pushed to the far right, to the right wing. I'm not going to say far right, right? Although there is a lot of far right within it. But here's the thing. So within that, there's different reformist groups. So you have Black Lives Matter, sort of Antifa, who are radicals. Don't ever get that wrong. Just because they are left wing and they're anti-fascist doesn't mean that they're not radicals. They are very much radicals. and they're violent and shouldn't be condoned. Then you've got the feminist movement, and just sort of like the LGBTQ plus whatever, right? Versus sort of, I wouldn't necessarily, I can't really think of many groups on the right. I mean, you've obviously got your super extremists like the KKK and whatnot.
I think
but
there was one called like something Boys, Proud Boys is one.
Proud Boys, yeah, or the Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter. The problem there is that there's been a miscommunication. I mean, the simple fact that Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter clashed is just a testament to how American politics has actually worked and how conflict politics has actually succeeded, in that the right pushed a narrative that Black Lives Matter was saying that black lives are more important than white lives. And so a sort of an angry white middle class who face middle and working class, who face just as many challenges as the black community, or maybe they might be less overt, because you should never discount anybody's situation, right? While what Black lives in America face is more difficult in terms of the racism and and their blocking of opportunities, it can't be ignored that there will still be large groups of white communities who will still be just as bad or maybe worse off, right?
Yeah.
And the fact is that nobody pushes that narrative in America. It's either the black people are oppressed completely, or the white people are being overtaken and oppressed by black people, or by a feminist agenda or whatnot, right? And the fact is that kids our age now, or kids in like their early 20s or teens, who are just sort of trying to understand the world and who just coming into their political beliefs, they end up getting placed with a choice, right? And this is where American politics spreads into UK politics and European politics as a whole, and I'd say world politics as well, right? In that, so you're either, if you're more conservative leaning, right, you end up having to sort of join hands and forces with the more extreme views in order to get your views the views of that side you do agree with to be heard, right? But then if you're on the left side, you also have to go with the extremists on the left side, in order to get your opinions heard.
Is it sort of like, for example, America's become such a two-party system that, for example, maybe left-leaning or right-leaning issues that are sort of in between won't be given the time of day?
Exactly, that is exactly it. But it's not only just in America, because if you see, even in this country, right, we have how many parties, right? We have countless parties, okay? The UK, for those non-UK members or those who don't really understand UK politics, basically there's always been a two-party system in terms of, it's either been the Tory party or the Whig party. When those developed, it was the Conservative Tory and then the Liberal Whigs, or it was the Conservative Party and then the Liberal Party. Then it was the Conservative Party and Labour Party, right? And essentially what's happened is that in the modern times, what we found is that there's a rise in parties such as the Liberal Democrats, although they've fallen off now. And there was a little bit of the UKIP scare in 2015, where UKIP, who are somewhat, the party itself isn't racist, but most of the members in the party were racist. It was a sort of a more far right leaning political party, and the fact that it got 10 million votes in the 2015 election should ring signs about the fact, and this is the reason it got 10 million votes was because the Labour Party, well, most of them, the majority of them used to vote for the Labour Party, and the Labour Party used to be socialist. It used to care about the working class, but now it's the party of the unemployed and the students, right? So what had happened is there was workers who've been left behind, and they feel left behind, but they don't want to vote for the Conservatives because the Conservative history and the reason that they're in their current situation is because of Margaret Thatcher and her reforms. So they end up voting for the parties that say that the real solution is to get rid of the immigrants, right? So they end up voting for them. But then there'll be people in there who go, well, I mean, to be honest with you, I may not be racist and I don't believe in the immigrants, but who else is there to vote for? Because I don't like the Liberals and I don't like Labour because they're pretty much the same party and they abandoned us. And I don't like the Conservatives because the Conservatives have sort of walked all over us in the past. So you then end up getting UKIP getting huge amounts of votes, the Brexit Party, you know. And this is only just the domestic side of conflict politics. It also comes into an international level, and this is where more the UK shines than the US, because the US is a lot of it is domestic nowadays, right? There's a little bit of that power dynamic where, you know, they were the world superpower, and then that's caused problems, but most of those problems have then developed domestically, right? They've become worse because of it, right? Whereas the UK is Brexit is a solution to the decline in UK power, because the UK internationally, if you look 100 years ago, the UK was still the leading global power, right? It was no longer the only superpower in the world or the world superpower. It was still the leading great power, right? So it still had the most influence, but it could no longer just do what it liked and then have nobody challenge it, right? And then after World War II, the victors of World War II, we were, you know, Britain, the victors of World War II. And then what do they see? Within 5 years, half their empire's gone. Half the empire's gone, right? But how is that? We won the war. Why have we suffered? Then we joined the EEC, or the European Economic Community, which, by the way, the Labour government at the time intentionally plummeted the value of the pound, which caused a recession in order to get into, because the EEC didn't like the fact that Britain's economy was too strong and they could have come in and had the strongest economy. So that's what happened. Which then, imagine that, right?
What was
You're
the
a
reason
British
for them wanting to join the EC?
EEC. So basically, the EEC, or European Economic Community, whatever, right? Basically, there were two blocks that formed, and it was West Germany and France who were the main drivers in the EEC. And then you had I can't remember exactly what it was called, but Britain had one with Switzerland, Sweden, Norway, and a couple other countries that weren't in the EEC. They're still not to this day. And basically what happened was Britain saw that the EEC was allowing Germany and France to outgrow their economy, so they decided to go on there in order to grow their economy the same amount as what Germany and France could, right?
So
in order to carry on.
I was going to say, sort of in layman's terming, was like, fuck you.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah.
Well, not really, actually. I shouldn't say that, because it was basically to retain power, like the power that they had, right? So, but if you look at it from like the British individual standpoint, leading global economy, right, for over 200, 300 years, right? All of a sudden, we won World War II. All of a sudden, we're no longer that. America's taken it, our former colony. We've lost most of our colonies. And even though we were the winners of the World War. And then on top of that, in order to join the EEC, they've made us plunge our economy into an incredibly terrible recession. So now we've joined the EEC and we don't see any benefits. We just see a bunch of negatives, right? Now that would change. You know, UK would integrate into the EEC more. And then in the 1990s, the EU was formed from the EEC, right? So, but the EEC or the EU then decided to have the single currency, right? Now, Britain were already attached to that, or the UK was already attached to the bank that sort of did that. So when Britain pulled out, it actually caused such a recession in the UK that it was like 3 times bigger than the 2008 recession in terms of its impact, right? It wasn't quite as bad in terms of like, you know, monetarily or whatever, right? Because that was a massive recession, but its overall impact in the next few months or in the short term was more impactful. But again, it wasn't as impactful as the 2008 recession. That's like another bag in of its own, right?
Yeah.
But look at it from the British perspective. The EU have just formed. We didn't ask for political integration. We only asked for economic integration, right? That's what the vote was in the 60s when the UK joined. But then they find out that not only have they tried to get rid of the pound, which is the strongest currency in the world. It still is today, even though it's depreciated.
When you say strongest, you mean like most valuable?
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Do I think there are some other currencies that are worth more?
No, so the most valuable is the pound.
Yeah. Gotcha. Yeah.
So the pound is the most valuable, but the dollar is used a lot more. The dollar is basically the base rate of a lot, but it shouldn't be forgotten that the pound is still, like in terms of its value, is stronger than the dollar, right?
Yeah.
And it's still the strongest in the world. So thanks for clearing that up, because I mean, like, there's different angles to look at it, but like the point I'm trying to make is the thing that most people will look at is that, right?
Yeah.
So now, so now there's political integration, which nobody voted for. We've seen 2 recessions as a result of joining the EEC and their actions, or the EU, whatever, right? Basically, this organization's actions have caused 2 recessions in Britain, right? And then on top of that, you've got like them basically sort of ignoring Britain's wishes and then just fishing in British waters. This is the biggest point. So the EEC, or the EU, sorry, the EU are now established. The EU basically, whatever was signed in the EU Parliament, right, for majority of laws, and it was actually supersedes. So basically, is stronger and more legitimate than any law that a country places in its own country.
Yeah.
Right. You can see the problem in that anyway, but now all of a sudden you've got Britain, who's pretty much lost its last enclave in Hong Kong. It's weakened. Its value, the value of the pound has dropped. It's recovering, but it's dropped. You know, it's a desperate time. You know, people are angry. People are starting to get angry. Then you see in like 2015, during the election, there's a large amount of people in not only the Conservative Party, but in UKIP and in even parts of the Labour Party and the Lib Dem Party, is that there's a massive call out for the UK to leave the EU, right? Now, this is where the conflict starts within domestic UK politics. So if you think about it, like, nobody was considering the EU as like this massive problem, right? People would have been a bit like,
was it sort of being swept under the rug, do you think? Or
yeah, it was being swept under the rug.
Okay.
Because at the time, the governments were pro-EU because, let's not get this wrong, right? A lot of the MPs who were in charge at the time have possessions in the EU. So Brexit would have caused massive problems there. But basically what ended up happening is you had the more nationalistic right wing come up and say, well, why are we listening to what Europe says? They disregard us. We put the most amount of money in the pot. We get the least out, whatever, right? And all these points. Why are we listening to them? Why is it that EU law, who have representatives who are unelected by the British public, why is that law more powerful than British law? Right? Why is it? So, but then you had the left who were saying that no, it would be devastating. The country would collapse. It would burn. It would be the end of British civilization, and it'd be awful for democracy and whatnot. And then you had people in the middle who didn't know what to do. So either they ended up not voting, or they just attached on to whoever was around them, whoever was the most vocal, which ended up being the Brexit.
I just sort of like to make a point. It's like, do you think, for example, a problem with democracy itself, for example, with Brexit, there was a lot of misinformation, obviously.
Yeah.
There was so much misinformation.
But there was also misinformation on the Remain side.
Oh no, of course, yeah, on both sides,
Yeah.
Just in general.
Yeah. Exactly.
Because, like, for example, sort of going back, because I was overhearing some stuff about like Socrates and stuff, etc. Because, for example, Aristotle, Plato, and Socrates were very against democracy. And, for example, Socrates was killed because of a democratic vote to kill him. He was executed, and it sort of go into a sense of like, their idea was people should not be able to vote on leaders, etc. and stuff unless they properly think about it.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure, for example, people listening who've have got an interest in this sort of stuff, it's something that they think about. But for the everyday person who has to care about their family, has to care about their work, it's
they're not gonna.
It's a waste of time putting that much thought into it. Do you know what I mean? And because
Exactly.
it seems so far away, would you say like a fault in democracy maybe is just people just don't have the time, or, for example, they're just not informed enough?
I think not even that, because even though you're informed, the most informed people will also still throw that rationality out. If they feel really angry enough. I think the problem is that it's an emotional thing. Democracy gives power to people, and as a result, people will vote based on their anger. Don't get me wrong, I'm still massively in favor of democracy. I mean, it's the best of bad options. I mean, there's not really a system that will ever be perfect. Okay,
like a lesser evil, yeah.
Exactly, but the thing is that the problem with democracy, you're right, it's that it's pretty much people don't have the time or won't have the willingness to understand or to sort of get to know each side of the argument and to properly educate themselves, right? Or some people might not have the capacity to. I'm not saying they're stupid. I mean, like, they might not have the resources or the know-how and understanding, right? So what then is the case is people vote based on emotion, but emotion can be easily played upon and implanted. And conflict politics is a massive symptom of this. Basically, the only reason why conflict politics even works is because democracy works, in that it gives power to people, and it provides the emotion that people are looking for. It's so I mean,
because
the problem is with sorry, carry on.
No, I was going because that sort of like breeds like a sort of like not corruption, but like
it breeds a cycle.
Yeah. I'm not advocating for anything other than sort of democracy, obviously.
Yeah.
But it's for example, a drug addict who's added nothing to society has the same weight as a political theorist. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. But I mean, but then again, it's also one of the beauties of democracy in that you always have a say. Um, and I mean, like, to be honest with you, yeah, the problem is democracy, but you can't really
At the same
unless
time,
you,
the good thing
yeah,
is democracy.
exactly. I mean, and you do the last thing you really want, right? Well, not that I know exactly what people want, but like the thing is, the last thing that anybody really truly wants is to lose their democratic freedoms. I mean, it's just not something that. I mean, unless you're a staunch monarchist or fascist or communist, whatever, right? Like an anti-democratic supporter, but
Do you
like,
think, in a way, for example, because Noam Chomsky sort of came up with an idea of manufacturing consent, of where
yeah,
the media sort of plays with you and sort of encourages you to vote, and like how you were saying, like the political elite and all that stuff,
yeah,
how they influence your media. For example,
yeah,
I'm sure the exact same happens in China, but that's perhaps more state controlled.
yeah. And I
And
mean, like, yeah. Carry on.
yeah, so like, for example, Chinese people might think
Yeah,
democracy is horrible. For example,
yeah,
as when America now, what's happening, they see that and they think, fucking hell, a
yeah,
government building's being stormed. Is that what democracy is? And so
yeah.
it's, without sort of going away from my point, which I've sort of wondered, but I've lost it. Fuck.
I mean, so yeah, like manufacturing consent, right? And that is a really good. That's a really good point. And Noam Chomsky is correct in that it's incredibly easy for the media to stir up, activity, to stir up, you know, anger or just consent. So the idea of manufactured consent is actually it's the fact that as long as you can convince people that they consent to this government, it's legitimate, right? Which is the problem with democracy as well, is that once a party is legitimately got 50% of the vote or higher than 50% of the vote, it's now a legitimate government, right? Everything it does is legitimate and it's rightful in that. Yeah, but then again, then if conflict politics comes into it, you have a problem in which you've seen historically. I'll use Germany and Italy for example, in that a democratically elected government. So the questions come in is that if a democratically elected government democratically remove democracy, does that make that legitimate or is it illegitimate? And are those people's rights being stripped away, thus then democratic because they voted for the party to get into power and the party got in legitimately?
It's such a difficult thing. I think let's try and go to sort of America.
Yeah,
An interesting thing that I heard or I saw, I'm not sure who. I
yeah,
think it might maybe Noam Chomsky again, but they or maybe anyway. Apparently, the New York Times, one of the big leaders in the biggest newspaper in America,
yeah.
has
In the world actually, it's one of
in
the
the
biggest
world.
in the world.
Oh shit! Well,
Yeah, yeah. Carry on.
have never. This is sort of going with America's peace, but have never said America has opposed peace.
Yeah,
So a person looked through 10 years and they looked it up, and in every single article mentioning peace and America was always for peace.
yeah,
Which, if you sort of look at the history of presidents,
yeah,
according to Nuremberg principles, each one of them could be indicted and thrown out.
for war crimes. Yeah, and that's true, but that's part of the manufactured consent and conflict politics because the fact is that it's us against them, isn't it? So at the end of the day, those American presidents they were only killing communists or Middle Easterns or whatever. They're the enemy. They're against us, so it's fine. It's fine for them to do that. They're for peace because these people are against peace. These people are anti-peace. And in the 2000s, these people are anti-peace. These villagers who are just living in their homes are anti-peace because they don't conform to the American doctrine. And I mean, but I'm sort of like, that came with a consensus, right? So it's really weird because domestic consensus, that then allowed for foreign intervention, right? But now that there's domestic conflict, nobody wants to get involved in foreign wars because they realize that, they don't want to get involved in the foreign policy because what has it done? It's caused the middle white class and working class to feel neglected and forgotten, and then it's caused the black communities to feel more oppressed because, well, the oppression of the black communities has gotten worse, and the oppression of many, or not, I shouldn't say oppression as such, but like the sort of the discrimination against them, is that they aren't necessarily oppressed in your general sense, but the discrimination against them in the feminists, in LGBT, in the black lives, they face more discrimination because what it is that during the consensus, everybody felt a sense of unity and that they were American and that it was them against these foreign enemies, right? So they didn't care what happened. So that allowed for the government to put security measures, which then stripped them of their rights slowly. So in one sense, conflict politics has actually stopped democratic freedoms from being stripped and has actually caused a situation in which people want change. On the other hand, though, it's stopping any change from taking place because the two sides see themselves as completely different, and one can't gain without the other losing. When it's not true, they can both sides can gain with each other. But that's not how they think because the government saw what was happening, and then the government institutions saw what was happening, and instead of allowing it to boil over into the point where they would have to make two sets of social change, they don't have to make any social change now, and they can just let people fight it out between them.
Yeah.
I mean,
so
carry on.
Sorry, no, you carry on, then I'll go on to...
Because I was just saying, it backfired a little bit with the storming of the Capitol building and the BLM protests, but at the same time, it also succeeded in that because now the Republican or the Donald Trump supporters who stormed it have been delegitimized. So now their frustrations can be rightfully ignored because now they're domestic terrorists, and then the BLM, right? They were rioters or they were protesters. Whichever one, because some of them were rioters and some of them were peaceful protesters, right? But now there's a side who don't want them to succeed because they feel which is the right wing, because they're like, oh well, now these people are gonna overtake us. They're chasing us out, whatnot. So it's a very troubled time, Although it's been a while. So hold on, actually, what were you gonna say? Sorry, before we.
I was sort of gonna go on the thing of Slovenian philosopher Slavoj Žižek said that in an interview. I think it was sort of along the lines of that he said to an interview, there's so much violence going on that you don't know because it's not change. So he said, for example, violence is only noticeable when there's change.
Yeah.
And for example, and that sort of links back to all presidents being, guilty of just war crimes. So, for example, Eisenhower invaded Lebanon and illegally overthrew the Iranian and Guatemala's democratically elected governments. And if you think, as if anything, the forefather, not forefather, but as the pinnacle of democracies America wants to be, why?
Yeah.
you know, and I think it was sort of a domestic policy of, I think in Iran anyway, is if you control the Middle East, then you've got serious control over, for example, oil, all that stuff, and it's a lot of power. But for example, just taking over a democratic government is just like fucking. It's just so, you know. For example, war crime as well. Obama, drone warfare, bombing of Yemen, Afghanistan, Syria, Sudan, Pakistan, Somalia, and overthrew the Libyan government. You know, Obama might be cool and all, but like, if for example Russia was doing that,
Exactly.
and it sort of goes down to that thing with the New York Times with peace. You know, but if it's not against America, or if it's against America, that's bad. And if it's for America, then it's good. But if anything, it's just it's worse than a lot of very massive dictators. Dictatorships.
Yeah, I mean, you're correct in that, like, you know, the narrative changes, but again, that's a further sign of because conflict politics, I've said it multiple times, comes in international conflict and domestic conflict. So you're correct in that, you know, how is it that America can go in and overthrow democratically elected governments, but then when another country does it, it's wrong? Like, I'll give you just a little bit of food for thought here. During the Arab Spring, with all the uprisings across the Arab world, Egypt, basically the dictatorship in Egypt stepped down and had democratic elections where they elected the I can't remember exactly what party it was, but they basically elected an Islamic fundamentalist party, right? And to be honest with you, Islamic fundamentalism, right, isn't just a terrorist ideology. Right? A lot of terrorists Muslims are Islamic fundamentalists, and not all Islamic fundamentalists are terrorists, right? They just believe that Islam should be up, and Islam can't really get out. Right? It would be like it's not going to happen. So what America did was, after this government got elected, they CIA-backed plot, and then put a Western favoring military dictator in, right? But then meanwhile in Russia had seized the Crimea, or had annexed the Crimea, after the Ukrainian government had lost control of it, and the people of Crimea had risen up in order to be annexed by Russia. So because the Crimean people were majority Russian. So they're both, so you could argue that the Russian actions were more legitimate. I mean, they were still illegitimate, but they actually had a more degree of legitimacy, and they were more justified than the American actions there. But because it didn't benefit America in both instances, America did what they liked and then pushed a narrative of, well, Russians bad, Middle Eastern's bad, Islamic fundamentalists are terrorists, and America good. Everything America does is good, right? So the West as a whole sort of has now come to see America as sort of less benign and more malevolent, that's the terms, but basically less loving and more violent.
Malignant.
But the problem is, pretty much. And it's just that, you know, they're now seen as. The problem is now is does the conform to China, or does it conform to America? Who should the rest of the Western world start to villainize? Do they villainize America? Do they villainize China? Do they villainize like everyone else? Do they not do what do they do? I mean, and I'm going to be honest with you, it's a little bit of a bad sign, because they're just sort of conflict politics has resulted in extremist governments around the world, right? The last major era of conflict politics, domestic conflict politics, I should say, because it all happens. There's always a massive worldwide era of domestic conflict politics. Obviously, it's not like a by and by, you know, because sometimes at one point of the world there'll be domestic consensus, and then the other half of the world will be domestic violence or whatever, right? But the domestic conflict in politics sort of globally has come about into the last major period of it was the World War II era, like the World War era. And what did we see there? We saw communist regime in Russia. We saw communist regimes in the East spread up, and then we saw fascist dictatorships in Europe and in South America. There were also communist ones in South America. And that was all there, sort of festering up and building up, and then there was wars, and the next era of conflict politics was less domestic and more international. But now we're in a weird time where it's now international and domestic. But the point I'm trying to say is the last time it was both was pre-World War One. Pre-World War One, post-World War One, pre-World War Two. Like if you look at it in Hungary, they have a right-wing government. In the mere fact that Macron was elected in France is like, it's baffling, because he's like he's super nationalist. Germany, surprisingly, are the least nationalist going, but if you look at it, in fact, there's been a rise in monarchist sentiment. I think the last time I checked, which was about 2 years ago, the consensus, or the amount of people supporting a return to the monarchy, was 20%, which was higher than it had been in previous decades.
Damn.
Right? And that's high. That's still a large amount. That's millions of people who want the monarchy returned, So conflict politics is now breeding a situation in which people are more likely to, where you get like the right wing who are more likely to give up some of their democratic freedoms in order to have protection from the left threat, and then the left wing who want to try and perform radical change in order to better the lives of a lot of people. But ironically, they're also pushing a message that makes the right feel threatened when they might not necessarily be threatening the right. So,
what do you think about this, Felipe?
Yeah, it's been a while since you've spoken.
It has, hasn't it?
Yeah, I was like going to point it out earlier, but we ended up on the next topic. But yeah, what do you think about this, Felipe? I'd like to hear your opinion on it, as somebody who's less politically sort of inclined and historically.
Let's. Oh, sorry, Felipe. Carry on. Sorry, my bad.
Yeah.
I really just don't really have a political opinion, to be honest.
Carry on.
I'm not really interested in it, but it's it's interesting to hear the history of it.
Yeah, I mean, if I asked you, so basically, if you were to look at it, say you had to pick left or right, what would you choose? Would you just?
I really don't know.
See, this was a good social experiment. Felipe is a normal, rational person. Okay. Felipe is quite clever as well. He may not say it, but Felipe is clever. Okay. And the fact you have to choose left or right when there's no sort of middle ground.
Exactly.
It's just fucking shit.
Yeah, I mean, Felipe doesn't like the whole politics or whatnot, right? He doesn't have a political opinion. Obviously, he's just said that. But there's nothing that appeals to him, which means there's a failure in democracy there, but a successful conflict politics, because now it's Felipe's. You can vote now, right? In the next election, who would you vote for? What would win you the election?
Oh my!
I can't vote actually.
Oh well, hypothetically you can vote, right? What would win the election? Like, if a party promised something, what would they need to promise in order for your vote?
I don't know. Probably, maybe more working class rights, employment rights, whatever. Maybe student rights as well.
Okay.
Because Labour did that last time.
Yeah.
But it wasn't very effective.
So say Labour, right? We'll go. So Labour are proposing more more. So they're going to say student rights, right? They
Yes.
focus student rights. But then you've got, say, the Lib Dems who come out of nowhere, and they say, well, workers' rights. Well, we'll focus on that. Although the Lib Dems wouldn't do that. Let me go UKIP come out of nowhere and they go workers' rights, which will benefit all the workers and it will lift up all of the poor areas.
Yeah.
What would you choose? What would you choose?
I really don't know. I'm just really apathetic about politics in general.
I mean,
think
you
that's
do
the
have
case
you
with
do
most
have a
people.
choice to just not vote. I mean, you could not vote if that's what
Yeah.
you wouldn't vote.
Yeah, exactly.
But there you go. So now you haven't picked a side, so you haven't voted. But guess what, Mister? Let's just say Miguel. He's super passionately Labour. He votes Labour,
Oh, blue collar workers.
right? But and say I join you, and I'm like, I don't really care. That means there's
Gender
only
neutral
one.
bathrooms.
So basically say that, right? I join you and I don't vote. That's 1/3 of
Yeah.
the population who hasn't voted. Yet Labour will have 100% of the vote,
Gender.
Exactly.
right? So what ends up happening is conflict politics wins out in that it pushes away the moderates.
Free
Puts them
university.
off. Yeah, it pushes away the moderates, right? Or it forces them to pick a side, so one might pick right or left just because they find themselves in common with more of the other, right?
Yeah.
And then what ends up happening is you have a situation where you get a radical government, right? Or like a government that might be more radical, in charge of a population that's either completely the opposite wing or was just put off of politics in general and doesn't really have doesn't want to make any comment because they're going to take flack from both sides.
Exactly.
You know,
I like shared experience.
Yeah.
Ashley goes to politics class in college. Not politics class, politics club. And I go there a couple
well,
of
I
times
also
because I think it's quite funny sometimes. Just seeing, like the girls with the feminists going, "What did you say?" And
Yeah.
the right wing boys going, "Hey!"
Yeah.
They come with their suit and briefcase, etc. But for
Yeah.
example, it's sort of like a silent majority. Those few people in that room, we go to very college. Those few people in that room, say about 20, who partake in that. If there was any sort of election happening in the college, their voices would be the loudest. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Exactly.
If you didn't take into account teachers, just the students, some of the shit those people say, like one person said, and I do not agree with this. That should put like a pig's head under a mosque. Now I don't know,
Yeah.
What the fuck?
Yeah, that is. Yeah, see,
But it's those sort of people, it's extremists with the louder voices, and it will be a case of, because it's so split between the two party system, you know, you can't vote for a middle ground because the middle ground doesn't exist because it's the extremists with the biggest voices.
yeah, exactly. And I mean, it's a massive thing. Whether or not you're a feminist or you're anti-feminist or whatnot, right? I don't care. Look, I'm of the opinion of you deserve your opinion, right? Um, I might completely disagree with you, and I might say you're a horrible person or whatnot, right? But you're still allowed to say it, in my view, right? I'm not gonna punish you or desire your death or whatnot just because you said it, right? But the thing is, as well, is that the danger comes in a situation of a really tense political realm, of when basically people stop bothering with politics, and then the only voices that get heard are the extremists, because rational people over time will start to become irrational if the only stuff they hear is extreme. If an extremist was going or like if an extremist was being an extremist, right?
The bitches being
but
bitches.
doing it constantly, and that's all you're hearing. The only thing you're going to possibly begin to agree with is the extremist, aren't you? Because I mean, why wouldn't you? Why would you even bother listening to the moderates? Because they've obviously got no power because they're not saying anything.
Yeah.
And I mean, like, that's just the sad reality of the world we're actually currently moving into. And in fact, I'd say we've even arrived there. And I would like to open up the debate further. In fact, or not the debate. Well, a little bit of a debate. You can put your opinions in the comments or whatnot, or berate me on Instagram, for this. But I kind of want to get your guys' opinion on it as well. Feminist movement or anti-feminist movement? Do you see a point in feminism, or do you? Right, because the reason I ask this is because it'll feed perfectly into conflict politics if this goes right. We could all end up agreeing, but anyway, yeah. So I want to get your opinion. So I'll ask Felipe first because he's not very talkative.
Yeah. So
So feminism or not feminism? Anti-feminist or pro-feminist?
I'd say
And your reasoning why?
I'm pro-feminist, but I'm not a moderate pro-feminist. I'm not all about
Yeah.
that kill all men movement.
Yeah.
I feel like there are aspects where they're not exactly equal.
Yeah.
They should be. But like, I'm not
Yeah.
about putting down men to make women higher, because kill all men is all
Mhm.
about making women higher than men.
Yeah.
Because the men are dead because they've been killed.
Yeah. Yeah, we understood that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else?
Yeah. That's why I'm feminist.
Right, fair enough.
Yeah.
Okay, and Miguel?
As a great scholar, Ben Shapiro once said, hypothetically, if we took a theoretical decision, I think personally, it's good. I think you're going to say, for example, there's like 12 different things of feminism. It just gets so complicated.
Yeah.
I think the normal rational person would say, of course, you want equal thing. I think Jordan Peterson, who I don't, maybe not politics wise, but psychologically wise, it should be taken very seriously. It's sort of like he sort of says that equality of income isn't so much good in the sense of it should be equality of opportunity. So in the sense of everyone should get the right opportunity, the equal opportunities. But if, for example, they're getting equal income, say for example a business getting the same amount of money as, so that's sort of more masculine job getting more money than, say for example a more caring job, which is typically more feminine. It's sort of like, just to word myself carefully, because it's a very sensitive subject, isn't it?
Yeah.
It's a sense of it doesn't mean that, for example, caring or more social, not caretaking, more social work is any less impactful, because I've got family members who do that work, and it's very important. Do you know what I mean? It's sort of the sense of people make their own choices, and if someone wants to choose a lower paying job, so for example women normally choose more low paying jobs, and it makes them happier, then it's fine trying to push people into women into STEM programs. But if they don't want to go into STEM programs, which is what's been happening essentially, it's not so much for debate. It's just it's like if both sides are the happiest doing what they do, then that's what's most important.
Yeah, I would see the So I would agree with that, and I have a very because obviously I've done this in my politics classwork, right? But it's very much when you look at the history of feminism, a lot of the radical feminists were originally they were correct in what they were doing, right? Their messages were very valid. There needed to be rapid and severe change. Nowadays, if you start to look at it from different angles, because the feminist movement is very divided in itself, it's one of the most conflicted ideologies that are out there, right? And it is an ideology. Um, it's one of the most conflicted out there. There are so many different branches. Like I can list off a bunch for you, right? And just for those who don't believe me, I'll list out a couple. There's liberal feminists, there's radical feminists, Marxist feminists, there's socialist feminists. They're very different to Marxist. There's post-feminism, post-modern feminism. Same thing, but slightly different. There's difference feminism. There's what difference feminism. I can't remember, equality feminism, stuff like that, right? And they all disagree with each other. I sort of take a little bit of aspects of each, and I look at it and I go, you know what? A lot of the movement as a whole has a lot of validity, right? And the more moderate side of the movement actually incorporates men's issues and men's inequalities, and they understand it. So a lot of it. So I'll take an example. One of the most famous feminists who kind of gets a lot of slack for it is Emma Watson, but she is the founder of a movement of feminism that actually pushes men's inequalities over women's inequalities. Right, so that's major, right? Because when you look at feminism and when you hear the word feminist, you don't think of that. You just think of the man-hating feminazis, as they've been branded, right? And that's a lot to do with the fact that men, and it is mostly men. It's women on the right as well will do it, but men on the right feel threatened because a lot of what the movement talks about, or a lot of what gets shown in the media by the governments who don't want to commit to change, but a lot of what gets shown in the media is essentially it's this massive it's basically this angry, hostile movement. So it's this hostile movement. So in actuality, what? Sorry, I'm stumbling on my words now. It's this massive movement. It's like this massive anti-men movement, but it's not, right? And the problem is that more and more people in the feminist movement are becoming radicalized because they feel attacked by the right. But the right are only attacking the feminist movement because they feel attacked by the radicals in the feminist movement. But I think we should the right wing can agree with a lot of what feminism says, but it doesn't because it gets told by the media what to do. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up sort of there at the end of that little. There's so much to go into in conflict politics and the history of it. We looked at a lot of modern politics, history. There's such an expansive look at it. And a lot of it you can get sort of like a feel of the differences in opinion if you look at certain philosophers and thinkers of different ideologies. I would sort of recommend people look at stuff like Thomas Hobbes, who believes the nature of people is that they need to be contained. There needs to be laws and they need to be restricted because otherwise they're savage. Karl Marx, who say that the state only does it to benefit the few. They only put these laws in place, and humans should be equal. Then you get the liberals who just say we need to be free. Nature is everybody's rational. Right? Then nowadays there's a twisting of each of those key thinkers and what they intended on saying. what they intended originally has now been twisted and turned against, and manipulated and molded into this sort of society of hate and rioting and violence, and it's a little bit of like a downward spiral in terms of not only rationality but democracy and its values. So I recommend, if we've made you interested in a topic, you should definitely explore it. Definitely explore movements if you were hesitant about movements such as feminism, LGBTQ plus, whatever. Look more into it, because not all of it is angry and hostile and trying to get rid of and trying to take away from you. And then if you were part of those movements and all you saw was everybody who isn't part of the movement, they're just trying to oppress you. They're not trying to oppress you. In fact, they might agree with you, but the more radical you're being, the more you scare them away. Think of it like terrorism, right? If you think of it like terrorism, if you or like trying to gain a political point. If you're trying to push a narrative, right, democratically, more people are going to listen to what you have to say. But if you start blowing them up, people are going to listen to you less, right? They're not going to listen to you. It's only going to be the radicals who listen to you. They're going to fear you and they're going to reject you. And I think that, at the end of the day, is what sums up conflict politics. And it's the fact that people start to resort to the terrorism aspect over the dialogue and democratic aspect, purely because they feel angry and they're told to be angry by the media, right? And we use the UK because we live there, and the US because they're more easily, everybody can relate to them. But I'd say no matter what country you live in, if you're watching this from around, let's hope. I'd hope we'd have multiple different countries. Otherwise, this warning's a little, or not this warning, but this little message is a bit rubbish, or pointless. But I would encourage you to just sort of look a little bit more at what your media and what politics goes on, because maybe you haven't gotten the clear picture, and maybe you can find yourself, when you look at it, maybe you're starting to lean a bit more into the more radical side of politics. But I'll wrap it up because this has been about an hour, or over an hour long, hour and a half long, maybe. I'm not too sure.
Very impressive.
Okay, so enjoy, and hopefully we should be able to get the next episode out in a shorter period of time. It won't be like 5 months in between. So
we're in lockdown right now.
Well, yeah, exactly. But it's also depends on college workload and whatnot.
College doesn't really count anymore, does it?
It does, but yeah, that's another debate.